I'm sorry to bring you here under false pretenses. You thought I was going to talk about swingers tonight. All right? Well, I'm not going to talk about swingers. I'm going to talk about...
Pull up your pants and go home then.
Well, go home. I'm going to talk about the followers of Captain Swing. Now, this is one of a series of 9 presentations which I'm doing on political prisoners who were sent here between 1788 and 1868. There were 9 different groups. I've already done 4. I think this is the 5th. And I think I'll be doing the Tolpuddle Martyrs, which is an important kind of pivotal moment in English history. Now, I'll give some background. Those of you who thought that the privatisation mania was big news in the 1980s and 1990s, it's small beer compared to what happened in England and Scotland and Wales between 1770 and 1830. 6 million acres of common land was privatised, given to the landowners. Now, what is common land? With the Norman invasion in 1066, there was this relationship between the lord, the squire, the tenant farmer and the peasant. And in order to avoid starvation, in order to create culture, they had what was described as common land. They could grow food on the common land, they could rear animals, they could have their festivals, whatever. But that belonged to the people. Those of you who've been to England in the last few decades will remember those, what do they call it? The walkers. What are the walkers called? The walkers, the trails, the little trails that still exist.
Oh, you mean the...
The little trails that you walk across in England that go across the estates.
And you can walk. Footpaths.
Trekkers. Yeah, trekkers. They're the remnants of the pathways which weren't privatised. And that's why people fight for that right to walk on those tracks. So what happened in the north of England with industrialisation, the enclosure movement forced people into the cities to work as labourers and wage slaves, mechanics, whatever, for a minimal wage. And this is when we talk about the satanic woolen mills. But in the south of England, the traditional relationships which existed between the labourer, the tenant farmer, the squire, the church, and the landowner continued. Now, I've spoken before about the way the English electoral system was gerrymandered, so the Tories, who are the representatives of the landowning class, continued to be re-elected. Now, 1830 was a very significant moment in British history and European history, because in 1830 the French once again revolted, like in during the French Revolution, they revolted and they overthrew the Bourbon King Charles X. And there was a fair bit of mayhem and a lot of fear was engendered in the English ruling classes, who believed that maybe this revolt would spread to England. Now, the new industrial entrepreneurial classes were gaining power in England during the first 30 years of the 19th century because they were bringing in money into the system and they were financially challenging the traditional landowners who relied on rent. They were rent seekers basically. And so what happened is that they threw their support behind a party which now doesn't exist, called the Whigs. Right? They were called the Whigs and they represented the entrepreneurial classes which were emerging in northern England. In June 1830, it was a very important moment in British parliamentary history because the Tories, despite the gerrymander, lost the election and the Whigs gained power. Now, the Whigs didn't gain power on a economic platform. They gained power on a constitutional reform platform. But the labourers and peasants in southern England, which was the breadbasket of England, found themselves in an exceptionally difficult situation in 1830. The land had been enclosed. The land had been enclosed. The farms had been unified into a bigger, they'd been amalgamated into bigger and bigger farms. Threshing machines and other machines were introduced into agriculture. And the landless labourers had no access to the commons. So they relied on a wage system to survive. Now, because forced amalgamation of these smaller farms into bigger farms increased yields, tenant farmers who employed the labourers, the peasants, these days, had their rent was increased, which they passed on to the labourers, right? So you had a situation in southern England where peasants in southern England were worse off than English slaves in the West Indies. At least as a slave, your property, and you don't really want to damage your property unless it gets out of control, right? So in southern England, research was done at the particular point, showed that people were surviving on half the calories, this is men, women and children, that were necessary for survival. So you've got these tens of thousands of peasants in southern England. The land has been enclosed. Laws have been introduced to stop them hunting, poaching laws. If you're caught poaching a rabbit, you could be hung. There were over 250 hanging offences in England at that particular point in time. So there were poaching laws, and although the laws against trade unions had been abolished in 1824, what happened is, because of the traditional relationships between labour, peasants and the landowners in southern England, that there was no question of them combining. So here we've got peasants, English peasants, who are receiving half the calorific intake they require to survive. They're living in basic conditions. The relationship they had with the Lord had been put on its head, through the enclosure movement. And they were basically wage earners. They saw the machinery that was introduced, remove them from the workforce, and at the same time, and you'll love this one, Paul will love this, at the same time, in 1795, they changed the poor laws. And what happened in 1795 meant that if you were a worker and your wages were low or you became unemployed, the state actually supported you to some degree. But like today, as we see in the social services industry, like today, the provision of state assistance was given to the local parish, the local church, right? And they set the rules and regulations regarding who could access just food. And to do that, you had to be accepted into the workhouses. And this is where the word cold, hard charity comes. Because the workhouses, you basically prayed and walked on a treadmill for 8 to 10 hours a day for your food. That was it. But if you drank, if you were not, if you drank, if you were not religious enough, you weren't accepted into the workhouse, therefore you starved. So you can actually see the situation they found themselves in. So in June 1830, the Whigs won power. There was revolution in France, the Whigs won power, and obviously people in southern England expected their situation to improve. But the Whigs weren't interested in improving the situation of working people. They were interested in improving the situation of the entrepreneurial class and, putting some limitations on the wealth of the rich, the landowners, right? So that's the situation. So people are waiting for some reform and some relief, but there's no reform, there's no relief. And in August 1830, in Kent, which is close to London, it's also close to France, it's the county that's closest to both, a movement sprang up, and just spontaneously. Because when you look at peasant revolt, they rise, they revolt, there's no organisation usually, and they just dissipate. So a spontaneous rebellion began. But there was a difference this time. The radical activists, were beginning to understand that the Whig program didn't really improve the situation of working people. And they changed their attitude to constitutional reform, to economic reform. So what that meant is that radical activists came down south, mainly into Kent, because that's closest to London. And there was an editor called William Corbett, Corbett. He owned a newspaper which was called the Political Register. And although most people were illiterate in southern England, some had some basic literary skills. So people would, this is like the internet today, people would grab the paper, somebody who was literate would read it out to everybody out in their village, and this actually enraged people because Corbett was talking about things like the calorie intake, what was happening, explaining things. So those of us who are involved in, propaganda work, like most of us are, it doesn't work. It does. It does, because it does influence people. So this influence began with the spontaneous revolts in villages in Kent. Now, one thing the English working class had learnt, and the English peasants had learnt, is never put your head above the parapet. Because if you put your head above the parapet, you'll be singled out and you'll be chopped off. So normally they would create mythical leaders like Ned Ludd, in the 1810s, 1812s we spoke about last time. So the mythical leader was Captain Swing, a dashing pirate-like figure like Paul there. on his stallion, he would go from village to village.
Was it a white one or a black one?
Black stallion, obviously. You can't have a white stallion, they get dirty in the mud. Yeah. Oh, come on, be realistic, Vic. So they're going from village, so Captain Swing didn't exist. So why do they call him Captain Swing? Now, I haven't seen anything, but my belief is he was Captain Swing because he was a menacing figure. Because when people were hung, and people were hung regularly in England at that particular point in time for the most menial crimes, they have to keep the body on the noose for an hour. So in the wind, because most executions were public, the body would swing in the wind, right? So Captain Swing became this menacing figure. So what happened is, as the revolt started to spread like wildfire across the counties, Berkshire, Hampshire, Dorset, Kent, and others, Leicester, as it began to spread, the revolt began to spread, what would happen is if you were a landowner or a clergyman or somebody who was involved in the workhouses, you would get these barely literate letters demanding an improvement in wages and a decrease in rent. And if you didn't do it, something terrible was going to happen to you. And every one of these letters, and there's many still in collections, public collections in England, was signed by Captain Swing, all right? Because nobody wanted to put their head above the parapet, because if you did, you got hung, all right? It's simple. So what would happen is there'd be a spontaneous meeting in a village, because remember, these were villages. There weren't many big towns in southern England. These were rural villages. There were no locomotives like in the north with industrialisation. So, the newspaper would come out, the political register, people would read the register, it would kind of excite them about the possibility of change. They'd have a meeting in the village, they would appoint leaders, or leaders would come out of the meeting, and then in the dead of night, first of all, they send out letters to the landlords and say, if you don't increase our wages and decrease our rents, we will come and burn your house. We will come and burn your barn. We will come and maim your cattle, all right? So if you've got hundreds, thousands of these letters appearing across the country, there is no way the authorities can actually contain what's going to happen. So if there was no response from the landowner, the next step was, in the dead of night, the whole village, all the men of the village, and occasionally some women, would wander around to the workhouses, to the tenant farmers, to the squires, clergy, occasionally to the nobility, and demand money. And you know what they demand money for? For them to destroy the threshing machines. Right. So it was a huge era of machine breaking. So I'd come to your farm, Vic, and I'd say, you're a bastard. We want £2 to destroy your threshing machines. And you would say, thank you very much, here's the £2. And then you would go off, and it was called collective begging, right? They would go off and then share the money amongst themselves, basically to buy food. So this became a huge issue in southern England from August to December 18...
Did they wreck the machines at the same time?
They wrecked the machines, the threading machine. And sometimes, to get around the law, because this was a hanging offence, they would ask the farmer to wreck his own machines and then pay them for the privilege of wrecking his own machines. All right? So there was this huge revolt. And this is the wheat growing belt of England, right? So landowners felt particularly under threat. Now, what this peasant revolt wasn't a revolution, it was a revolt, and they wanted to return back to the traditional ways where there was a mutual obligation between the landowner and the peasant. And the land that was enclosed was the peasant's safety valve in terms of economic downturn, where they could grow their own food, rear their own animals so their children wouldn't starve. Okay? So the Whig government sided with the Tory opposition to restore order in southern England. All right? So what happened was that legislation was passed which criminalised the most simple things, like there were hanging offences or transportation offences. Things like sending a threatening letter was a hanging offence. Things like collective begging was a hanging offence. As I said before, things like poaching, a hanging offence. Things like burning a haystack, a hanging offence. But obviously, when there's a generalised revolt, the state normally doesn't actually have enough people to curtail that revolt. Although in Dorset, one of the local magistrates called, and I want you to remember this name, James Frampton, because he's very important in the Tolpuddle case next month. He read the Riot Act and ordered the yeomen to come in to put down the revolt. But it didn't happen everywhere because the peasants had support. They had support from small farmers who were tenants, which they worked for, and they had support from some of the squires. But no support from the workhouses, obviously. The other thing they did is they burnt down the workhouses because they were the most hated institution, even more hated than the landowner, because they were the visible example of what happens if this happens. So, our very own Home Secretary, who was called Lord Melbourne, who this fair city is named after, the Home Secretary for the Whig Party, for the British Parliament, was given authority to put down the revolt through legislation and obviously through arrests, through trials, through executions and through transportation. Now, the fascinating thing about the revolt, and this is just fascinating, between August and December, there was not one death. Not one landowner was killed. Not one squire was killed. Not one, employee in a workhouse was killed. Nobody. Even the Times, which is a very conservative paper in those days, lauded the peasants. Unlike their French counterparts, they weren't burning down the estates of the rich and powerful and killing the rich and powerful. They were being, because it wasn't a revolution. They expected the king and the gentry to look after them, like they did in the past. I'll give you an example. In Hampshire, there was a little radical club and a musical club, believe it or not, and two brothers, John and Joseph Mason, who I'll speak about later on, gathered 177 signatures, asking for parliamentary reform and assistance. And Robert Mason went down to Brighton, as you do, and handed the petition to the king with these signatures that they needed assistance, because the peasants at that stage still believed in the mutual obligation, and they still believed that somehow Parliament, the new Whig government, which was a supposedly reformist government, and it was in terms of abolition of slavery, was going to take their side. But it never eventuated. So Lord Melbourne was given power to set up special commissions, which were special courts around the south. Troops were sent in, people were arrested and tried. Now, remember, not one person was killed during the 5 months, which is extraordinary when you think about it, considering the depth of the poverty, which was, you'd seen your kids starving, it was terrible. 1,976, there are good records, were arrested and tried. 252 were sentenced to hang. 19 were hung of the 252, and an extraordinary 503 men and 2 women were transported to Australia, because Australia was the Guantanamo Bay of the British Empire. Because what you've got to understand, that if the breadwinner, the major breadwinner, and that's the peasant labourer, goes to jail, the family becomes destitute. And if the workhouse won't accept the family, it means starvation, prostitution. That's what it means for your family. So these arrests and transportation had major consequences in the English countryside. I'll give you an example. John Balls was a labourer. He sent a threatening letter to one of the farmers. He was sentenced to 14 years transportation to Van Diemen's Land, and he had 10 children who slid into poverty because you can't pay the rent, you can't buy food, you're not accepted into the workhouses because your breadwinner is a rebel and a convict, and it destroys that whole network of families. And obviously, we talk about mutual obligation and a collective thing. People did what they can, but when you've got very little, it's very hard to help a neighbour who's got nothing. And that was the dilemma. So, the 505, right, were transported. Now, the two women were transported are quite interesting. It was Elizabeth Parker, who was a labourer from Gloucestershire. She was 24. She was originally sentenced to 4 months. Then they retried her as an example, and they sent her to Australia for life. The other one was Elizabeth Studham. That was they're the two women that I could find. Now, of the 503, the Mason brothers, John and Robert, were put on separate ships. They came out in 2 ships. The Eleanor, which took half of the convicts to Sydney, and the Eliza, which took the other half to Hobart. And guess who was in charge of Tasmania then? Good old George Arthur, the disciplinarian. So, you've got these, what we call the aristocracy of the working labourers, people who could read and write. So people who were actually sent away as convicts may not have even been involved in the actual writing of the letters and menacing, their richer neighbours. But the fact is they could read and write. And the fact that they read the political register by William Cobbett to their fellow villagers was seen as a crime. So it was also an excuse to round up the troublemakers, and they were people who believed they had some limited rights, like the Mason brothers, Joseph and Robert. So, profound impact. So, what happens? They arrive in Australia, and guess what? The squatters were rubbing their hand in glee in New South Wales and Tasmania. These were not your normal criminals who'd been made, normal outcasts and marginalised people because of the Industrial Revolution, who were chronically unemployed in the urban centres. These were skilled people. There were agricultural labourers who knew about farming. There were stonemasons. There were blacksmiths. There were wheelwrights. It was a bit like winning Tats Lotto for the squatters. And they started bribing government officials here in Australia to assign them convicts with particular skills. Because in 1823, you'll find this wonderful, in Australia, before 1823, convicts who were assigned to the squatters had to be paid a little bit of money. But in 1823, the law was changed and you got totally free skilled labour. So they were welcomed. They were welcomed in Sydney. And many of them actually got good jobs as convicts, were assigned convicts. And there are letters written back saying, it's a paradise. It's a paradise, although they were convicts. Others wrote back and said this is terrible, obviously. And there are some interesting books that you can look at. There's An Exile's Lamentations, which was written by Thomas Cook, a 19-year-old. I'll tell you later on, don't worry. An Exile's Lamentations. He was 19 and he wrote about his experiences in here. But many of them did very well. So, what happened in England? The Whig government passed the Great Reform Bill in 1832, which introduced important constitutional reforms, which led to the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, which led to a different attitude to Aboriginal people around the world, which they had colonised. I mean, the only reason the Myall Creek massacre, the shepherds involved in the Myall Creek massacre, were actually executed was because the British Whig government demanded they be tried and retried until they were found guilty, because they had a bit of a social conscience. No conscience as far as economics was concerned. So what happened is that the revolts in southern England are dismissed usually as nothing important. They're just dismissed. But the fact is, it was those very revolts which pushed the Whigs to introduce the Great Reform Bill in 1832 and to markedly decrease the number of hanging offences offences you could be hung for in England. It was that push, because they were concerned and they saw what little control they had when village after village after village revolted. There was no way, as they saw in 1854, the Eureka Rebellion, there's no way they could put down that type of insurrection without introducing reforms. But it was the 505 that was sent to Australia are those who paid the penalty. Them, their families, their villages, they paid the penalty. And there was a lot of resistance in southern England, a lot of resistance to being involved in the productive process. People weren't working. The wheat wasn't being grown as it should be. Things were going haywire. So there was a movement was created which pushed for the convicts to be pardoned, believe it or not. They arrived in Sydney on the 26th of June 1831. And remember, people were sentenced for 7 years, 14 years and life. There were the three sentences you could get. Because of pressure on the Whig government, because the production had decreased and because of the dislocation which was occurring in southern England, what happened is in 1835, anybody who'd been sentenced to 7 years was completely pardoned, given a ticket of leave. There was only one catch: you had to pay for your own voyage back to England. All right. In 1837, 2 years later, this is 6 years after they arrived, every convict who had come across on the Eleanor and the Eliza were pardoned, whether they were serving 14 years or life. Everybody received a pardon, which is quite extraordinary when you actually think of the pressure that was placed on the government because of the economic dislocation which occurred in southern England, because when you remove the more active people in a society, other people resist by not being, by not cooperating. So, what happened to the 505? Now, you may find this surprising. Many stayed in Australia. They thought to themselves, it's better here than going back to England. I got food here. 20%, over 100, were given land, which obviously had been taken from the Aboriginal population through the colonisation process. They were given land. Many paid for their passage back to England, and then when they got back to England they said, well, this isn't good enough. And what they did is they brought their families back and they came back as free immigrants. And interestingly, there's been some very good work, academic work done on all the convicts which were on the Eleanor, which went to Sydney, and 20% of them have got Australian descendants. Yeah. So, did any of them get involved in political activity in Australia? No. Well, did any of them get rearrested? Very few. Very few. Most of them fitted in quite nicely. The thing about the convict system was that there was a hierarchy you could actually climb up, which you couldn't do in England because of the rigid class divisions. Class was everything in England. But in Australia, at that particular point in time, you could be a convict and 20 years later you could be a magistrate, and it happened over and over again. Or you could be a great landowner or whatever, because obviously they needed to incorporate people in the new society in order for that society to flourish economically. But what I found fascinating is I knew nothing about this. I knew nothing about Captain Swing. We all know about the Luddites, but see, the Luddites, the followers of Captain Ludd, they were just a nuisance. They were a nuisance to the English emerging entrepreneurial and industrial class. They weren't a nuisance to the landowners because it didn't affect them. So we tend to remember them. But the Swing Revolt, which has been described as the last peasant revolt in England, the Swing Revolt of 1830 called into question the new relationships which had occurred because of industrialisation. And it was a situation of potential revolution, a revolution that never thrived, but it's a potential revolution. So I think, to a significant degree, there was more machine breaking in the 1830 swing revolt, hundreds of times more than what happened with the Luddites in 1811 and 1812, when the new, and I think in many degrees we tend to forget, hide, not look at the history of movements which pose a potential threat to established structures. And I think that's why, to a significant degree, we don't hear about the swing movement. We hear about the Scottish martyrs, we hear about the Tolpuddle martyrs, we hear about the Irish rebels, but we don't hear about, these are the other groups of political prisoners that came around. We hear about that in the historical record, but you don't hear about the swingers, the followers of Captain Swing, and the profound impact they actually had, not just on the English landowning class, but the impact they had in this country, because they came with skills. They were welcomed. As I said before, the squatters were bribing the clerks who were assigning different convicts to different squats. So, yeah. So it was a fascinating period of English history. But I don't understand why people don't know about it. And when I'm talking about idiots like me.
What are you talking about?
Who knew?
When you go to school, they teach you nothing. That's why nobody knows.
Well, they do teach you about the convict system. They teach you about Port Arthur. They teach you about these peripheral things. But they don't teach you the fact that of the 160,000 convicts that came here during an 80-year period between 1788 and 1868, that over 3,000 were political prisoners. We're not told that. Not just us, but nobody apart from some, academics.
And you know what, Joe, what you're talking about is slowly coming in right now.
No, I'm not arguing about that. I agree.
It's coming straight in right now.
Yeah. But this what I want to do is I want to draw parallels, all right?
Yeah.
I want to draw parallels. See, what we've seen over the last, after World War II, we saw a huge movement of people who'd sacrificed their lives in war, demanding something better. That's why Churchill was voted out of Parliament after the war, and a Labor government was introduced that had a, cradle to grave social security policy. People want something better. So what happened is the state was transformed to a significant degree from an instrument of oppression to an instrument which provided services to the population. This was the reform. That's where you had public housing, public health, public education, public infrastructure, public essential services. Now, all these things were a direct result of that push post-World War II by working people to improve their situation. They demanded the state, not private enterprise, but the state looked after their needs. Now, over the last 50 years, during the privatisation, globalisation, corporatisation and deregulation, neoliberal revolution which has swept the world, not just Australia, what we've seen is all these essential services either disappearing, being privatised, being undermined, or being underfunded. So today, in the public's mind, anything which has got the word public next to it is deemed to be second rate and not worth saving. Public education, public health, public transport, public infrastructure, and the list goes on and on. So what privatisation, the parallels between the enclosure movement, where the land which belonged, the commons which belonged to the peasants, which was their protection against starvation, was removed, and what we are now seeing is the protections which are afforded to people who are on social security benefits, and people, and most wage earners, not all, but most wage earners, have now been removed. And you've got to access them in the private sector. And if you can't access them in the private sector, you've got to access them through your pocket. Aged care, early childhood development, just simple things which should be accessible to everybody. I'll give you an example. I was talking to a man I know yesterday who's organised a number of meetings from the community and social housing sector. Now, these are secret meetings. I'll tell you why. Because nobody will come to them who's in a community or social housing estate because they're concerned about being evicted. Now, with public housing, everybody has an equal chance. You don't cherry pick. It's like when you go to a hospital, you can be a bum, a drug addict, an alcoholic, a mass murderer, and you go to the public health system, you're treated for the problem you have. All right? That's acutely, if you've got an acute emergency situation. All right? So what's happened is that we are reverting back to that concept where the state no longer provides for people. It's become an instrument of oppression. All right? It's gone back to its original role. And that's why when you have a budget like we had yesterday, you've got a budget, all the parliamentarians can do is fiddle at the edges, because they no longer, what we've seen is what we saw in England in the early 19th century, where Parliament is no longer something which belongs to everybody. Parliament has now become the preserve of people with assets. So there are a lot of parallels between the early 19th century and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and what that happened, and the early 21st century, the beginning of the digital revolution, and what is occurring in our society today. Yep. Now, if you've got money, I can give you the best education in the world, the best healthcare in the world. But when you go to the private sector, they cherry pick. That's how they make their profit. I mean, we've got to the situation, we find ourselves in this situation because we as a people, maybe not you, but we as a people have accepted the idea that anything that is publicly owned is second rate and bad. And it is second rate because resources are not put into the public sector. Corporate welfare is the biggest, and what corporate welfare is, it's the government giving taxpayers' money to the private sector to, improve their business opportunities or expand their business, right? We're seeing this in the green energy field. Billions of dollars going to the private sector. We saw that in the budget last night, where Mr. Chalmers didn't once mention the word public housing. Huge housing bill, social housing, community housing, affordable housing, but never once used the word public. So we're seeing everything being privatised. So in many regards, it's exactly what happened during the enclosure movement. Now, I think what will happen is what we saw initially in the enclosure movement. I think that as pressure increases on people, there will be spontaneous kind of little rebellions here and there, little spot fires occurring when people have had enough. Because the dilemma is, although the government tells you there are all these institutions to protect you from the private sector, when you go to complain to these private institutions, they don't have the legislative ability or the resources to actually handle your complaint. It's just an illusion. Yeah. So I think there will be spot fires, that people will start doing things like happened in the 1830s.
Yeah, just take a look at what's happening today, Joe. Big corporations are throwing all the smaller farmers off their land. That's right. Worldwide.
Yeah.
Canada, Holland. Just take a look at those.
It's not. Nothing is new. It's not new.
15-minute city. Take a look at Oxford in England. Locking the people away to you can only travel in a small.
Yeah, but Vic. What I'm saying is this isn't new, right? No, this is exact. What's happened is things have gone back to the beginning. We've got the Industrial Revolution, Now we have the digital revolution. Changes occur when the way people earn their income is radically altered. That is the moment when things happen in any society, and we are seeing that happening today. Now the dilemma is, unless we come up with some type of reasonable alternative, and that's why we created public interest before corporate interest, we come up with some type of alternative, all you'll have is spontaneous revolt after spontaneous revolt, which will be put down brutally, quickly, because the state has a monopoly on the use of violence, and they have a monopoly on the legislative agenda. For example, it's illegal to strike.
The problem is with that, Joe, they're bringing troops and police in from other countries.
Well, it happens all the time, yeah. Well, they don't need to.
They don't need to, but they do it.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, we are at a critical phase in this country. Which way we're going to move to a significant degree doesn't depend on the old analysis, the old Marxist analysis that the state is going to resolve our issues. It doesn't depend on that anymore, although we've seen the resurgence of that type of movement. What we need to be able to do is create a different type of movement, but in an era when everybody thinks that this is the only way forward, private investment for private profit, we've got a huge task ahead of us, huge task.
Yeah, but what people don't realise yet, all their land, their houses, they're all going to disappear. And you're not allowed to, it's just communism coming in, right?
No, it's the other way around. No, it's not communism coming in. It's an authoritarian, radical capitalism. It's a corporate capitalism.
Yeah, but everybody's going to call it that.
Well, they're going to call it that, but it isn't.
No, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, it's corporate capitalism.
But by the time they realise that that's happening, a lot of damage will be done before they wake up.
Yeah, but the difference is there are options still available in our society.
Yeah,
we can meet here. We can meet here and not be carted off for 7 years. All right.
Yeah. But Joe, these people are busy going to the footy.
Yeah. But that's life. That's the way life is. Most people are not politicised, right? Which is good, because it means people are capable of change. We're not a polarised society. We may be polarised in terms of identity politics, in terms of race, in terms of culture, in terms of divisions between First Nations and the rest of the community, but we're not polarised in terms of economic alternatives. There are no economic alternatives. That's the dilemma. There are no significant political, social, cultural movements apart from, small groups here and there which are looking at different economic alternatives. So, any questions about the swingers? You've written a lot of things down, Jan.
Try to. Can I just say, you haven't written the thing down there.
No.
Doesn't have to.
How do you do it?
I made it all up.
Oh, did you?
This is a quantum computer.
But it was just, it's that, just the...
You can do it.
Some of the things, I'd have to write it down and I'd have to refer to my notes.
What you need to do is you need to find good sources, look at the sources, read them, reread them, read them again, reread them, and it'll sink in, and then you create a narrative. This is something a lot of people can do.
Experience.
It's experience, yeah.
Just wondering about, okay, so there was no organisational legacy in Australia. People had paid their dues. It hadn't worked out too badly, so they got on with life. I get that.
Yep.
But what about back in England in terms of...
Well, back in England, as I said, the movement to pardon the rebels. Well, back in England, the next phase is what we talk about next month. All right, because what happened is the peasants began to understand that spontaneous uprisings which were crushed by the state was not the way to go. Now, the Combination Act, which was the Anti-Union Act, had been repealed in 1824, but only the northerners in the industrial, where they created a new culture, a proletarian culture, a working class culture, were forming unions. There were unions being formed in Australia in the 1820s and 1830s, which I've spoken about in the past. So what the next phase was, the Tolpuddle Martyrs. So that was the first attempt by agricultural labourers to form a union. And they didn't do that spontaneously. They did that in conjunction with a London-based pro-union group. And I'll talk about that next month. Because I thought the Tolpuddle Martyrs wasn't that important. But when you actually look at why it happened, why they were framed, why they were sent here, why they were pardoned, and how important it was in England, it was really the very beginning of a unified, generalised trade union movement, which crossed from the industrial sector to the agricultural sector.
But I've been to Tolpuddle and I've read went to the and there was nothing on the swingers or Captain Swing or anything. I never saw.
No, there's nowhere. See, the Tolpuddle Martyrs is something that you can actually identify with. You got 6 men or 5, whatever it was. I'll have to do my study for next month. And the thing is, you're right. Everything is depoliticised. It's
or decontextualised.
Or decontextualised and it's like most Australians didn't know there were First Nations people here. Didn't understand what had happened, what the colonisation process was like, the continuing legacy. It's because, what was his name? The bloke who lost the Inconvenient Truth. The bloke who lost the presidential election. What was his name? Al Gore. He talked about inconvenient truth. Yeah. It's an inconvenient truth that constitutional change does not improve the lives of people generally, and it's also an inconvenient truth that unless you've got major economic change in an egalitarian fashion, that it's not going to improve things. And the vote, it's an inconvenient truth that it doesn't really help in a society where the fourth estate is owned by a few individuals, and even with social media, all we get is the divisions between people, which are highlighted because that brings eyeballs to social media. We see more ads, we make more profit for them. So let's have a bit of bondage, a bit of swinging, a bit of torture, get the eyeballs there, and we can make a profit.
Had a bit of difference getting the extension of the franchise, because that's happening at the same time as the swing revolt, basically, the extension of the franchise.
No, it was after. It was after. Yeah. Well, the working people were going for 2 things: the extension of the franchise and improve economic conditions.
So in a way, we're going back. Is it back to the future?
We're going back to the 19th century. That's what I'm saying. Yeah. The parallels are extraordinary.
They are. That's fascinating.
When I looked at the enclosure movement, I thought, this is privatisation on steroids.
The other day I got a book. I listened to books to go to sleep, and I got this book. Can't remember the name of it, but it is exactly what you've been talking about. But it was written as a romantic novel, and the political context wasn't there, but it was literally, and it was more about the social, the individual suffering of people and whatever. But and I thought, oh, this is interesting.
See, this is the Jane Austen. This is the Jane Austen period.
Yeah.
Everybody reads Jane Austen, and these are the level below the ruling class, and they need to marry off their daughters so they don't have to work and make income from rent. But in Jane Austen's novel, are any of the characters that do the work actually part of the story? No. Are their characters developed? They're not.
No.
And it's interesting that we as a society, because we're part of obviously the British Empire in this country, we as a society concentrate on that, not the wider picture. And that's no accident. Because examples are important, and that's why I've been doing this research. 'Cause examples are important. Yes, Gareth?
So the gold rush was happening...
No, the gold rush didn't happen for another 20 years.
Right.
This was 1830s, yeah.
And another thing we're seeing, which Joe said, that if you look now, the state's not about providing welfare or public utilities, housing, transport. It's just about discipline and law and order.
I think it's about trying to keep an even keel so people can continue to do their money, do their rather than there's no real change for us.
Well, there's no real change because there's no real movement for reform. We're all caught up in this, identity politics loop, or this hatred, where you've got the extreme right and the extreme left, they at each other's throats every day. And the fact is that in many regards, when you talk about corporatisation, deregulation and privatisation, you'd be amazed at the similarities in how they speak. But obviously they see it as a method, as a mechanism of, ostracising the other. It's like it was the machine's fault. It wasn't the system's fault in that period. It was the machines, the Freshie machines they fought. And you get people on the extreme right, and that's why we've got the rise of the right, because they can actually point to people and say, they're a different colour, they're a different religion, they're the enemy, they're the problem. We have got a problem because we understand that we can't, that's not the issue. The issue is a much deeper structural issue, and that's the dilemma. And that's a much harder story to sell.
Well, the smarter members of the right are actually pointing at the ruling class.
Yeah.
They're saying, people of different colour are being manipulated. And we might have to fight them, but it's not primarily them. It's the and that's close enough to the truth. It's a distortion of the truth, but it's close enough to actually have an appeal.
Can I just ask, the 550 that were transported...
505.
505. From where? Mainly from one side, like from the Western Australia?
No.
All around the same?
No, the 505 that came to Australia, they came on two ships, the Eleanor and the Eliza. Those on the Eleanor went to Sydney and then were dispersed into New South Wales, and those that went on the Eliza went to Hobart and were given out as, unpaid workers to the squatters in Tasmania. Right? So that's what they did. They split them in two.
The Eliza and
Eleanor. Yeah. So, yeah. And if you're really interested in this little subject, there is a brilliant book which has been written by academics regarding the fate of the convicts which came across on the Eleanor, and it's called The Eleanor. It's a,
Remember the Alamo?
Yeah. I don't remember the Alamo.